Trump signed an executive order creating a Justice Department task force to root out anti-Christian bias and discrimination within the federal government. The group will also prosecute violence and vandalism against Christians. Joining us now to discuss Trump's new task force on anti-Christian bias is Bangert, Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Special Counsel to the President at Alliance Defending Freedom. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here now with this new DOJ task force to halt anti-Christian targeting within the federal government. Give us a sense just how widespread is anti-Christian bias across the federal level.
Well, the anti-Christian bias has been incredibly widespread at the federal level all throughout the last 4 years. This executive order that President Trump just signed today, contesting anti-Christian bias is necessary for a variety of reasons. Look at the examples that we at ADF have contested. There was an executive order issued by President Biden that really instituted a number of discriminatory practices, starting with Title IX, starting with gender identity. We had to sue the Biden administration over and over and over again, simply to defend the rights of Christian colleges, universities, medical practitioners, and others to live out their faith on a daily basis.
And expanding on that, we saw the FBI under the Biden administration face backlash over a leaked memo that depicted traditional Catholics as violent extremists and proposed spying on them in their churches. There was also a major scandal under the Obama administration with the IRS's aggressive scrutiny of conservative groups, including Christian organizations. What can this task force do to counter this and preserve its work even under, say, a future Democratic administration?
There's so many things I think this task force can do. And you're absolutely right to point to the bias that was evident within the FBI, not only labeling traditional Orthodox faithful Catholics as a potential security threat, but also labeling parents as potential terrorists simply for peacefully contesting school board policies during the COVID era. Don't forget that the Treasury Department also sent out guidance to banks, warning them to monitor transactions with nonprofit groups that were labeled as hate groups by an overseas organization. These are groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, Family Research Council, and others. So all throughout the law enforcement apparatus of the Biden administration, including the FBI, we saw baked in an anti-Christian bias. This task force, I think, can perform some very important work by getting to the bottom of how these decisions were made, rooting them out, and ending these kinds of biased decision-making processes once and for all.
Now, the White House fact sheet mentions this task force will submit an annual report on its progress with a final report upon its conclusion. In your view, how can this help to protect the First Amendment?
Well, oftentimes the first and best solvent against bias and discrimination is sunlight. And I think that this report will shed a great deal of light on exactly what was happening within the Biden administration over the last 4 years, as time after time after time, we saw anti-Christian bias exhibited through enforcement of federal law, through non-enforcement in the case of the FACE Act, when the FBI and DOJ refused to enforce the FACE Act, when churches and synagogues were attacked, but yet were arresting peaceful pro-life protesters and activists who were, in some cases, 70-plus-year-old women who were simply peacefully protesting on sidewalks. Having this report in hand to identify and expose exactly what was happening will be an incredibly valuable contribution to defending religious liberty here in the U.S.
And with this task force specifically for anti-Christian bias, do you see there being any concern that the federal government could be perceived as being too partial to certain faiths?
Well, I don't. And that's because for the last 4 years, we have seen the government being partial in discriminating specifically against the Christian faith. Obviously, at ADF, we defend the God-given right for all to live and speak the truth, people of all faiths. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there were very specific attacks being made on Orthodox beliefs held by those of the Judeo-Christian faiths all throughout the Biden administration. And I think it's very appropriate that the task force will focus specifically on that issue.
And President Trump saying, quote, if we don't have religious liberty, then we don't have a free country. We probably don't even have a country. Talk to us about what this change with this task force means for the country more broadly. What changes can we expect to see as a result?
Well, the change that we hope to see is a federal government that respects all faiths, all beliefs, that's not targeting any faith or any tenets of one faith for prosecution or for discrimination under federal law. Federal law already, under the First Amendment and also under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, requires the federal government not to discriminate or target specific religious faiths. We believe this task force, hopefully if it is put into practice the way that we believe it's intended, will simply act to reinforce those basic guarantees that the federal government is not going to be taking action hostile to any religious faith because of that faith's beliefs.
Ryan Bangert, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.